Welcome to The Passion Pod with your host, Chris Johnson. Thanks for joining us. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the feature presentation.
Welcome back, friends. Today we're sitting over at the Pablo Center with a guest that I became familiar with a long time ago. I went to UMD for college, and when I got there, all the Minnesota kids had to talk about the Minnesota rap. And I was like, tight, so what is this? So I heard this group, Doomtree. I was like, damn, there's a girl on this. Because back then, I mean, this is like 15 years ago, I didn't really hear that too many female rappers at the time. I was like, damn, this chick's good. Well, then years went by, and I kind of like forgot all about it. About 4 years ago, all of a sudden this name popped up again, and a friend of mine was opening, and he goes, are you going to the Dessa show? I was like, who's Dessa? I recognize that name. Why do I recognize that name? And he goes, Doomtree. And I was like, hell yeah, I'm going to that show tonight. That's going to be sick. So anyways, check the show out 4 years ago. Fast forward 4 more years, and we have Dessa all the way here at the Pablo Center. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so stoked that you're here. You've been doing music for a really long time, but you left. Why'd you leave for New York?
So I still live in Minneapolis, like half-time. So
okay.
So I'm in New York half-time. In part, I've always loved New York. My family, my mom's side is from there. And I'd had a crush on it, I think, since I was little. Some of it, probably for the reasons that, when I would visit, I loved the energy of it. I love the bustle. And some of it, I'm sure, is just like the romanticism of the city. But I really like that place. I really love New York.
Yeah, I'll admit, I was going to LA for a lot of interviews for a second. And then I went to New York for the first time. I was like, I don't want to go to LA again.
Hands down, yeah.
New York has got such a cool, artsy vibe. And one thing, and I'm not trying to, talk smack about everybody in LA, but the attitude of people is totally different, too. It's just a very, very different energy. People seem to be, which you don't typically get this in a big city, but people seem to be really down to earth there.
Yeah, I admit for me, it's no contest, LA and New York. And again, I know LA is an enormous city. Am I familiar with absolutely every neighborhood in and out? Nah, but for my money on my visits, it's New York hands down. And I think that city gets sort of an unearned rep for being really, the rudeness. Are people, direct? Sure. Is there conflict? Sometimes, sure, of course. But people are playful on the street. You end up having conversations with strangers, in my experience, way more often than in most cities that I visited.
Well, I like when people are direct anyways, because
Sure.
I feel like in other areas, people kind of dance around what they're getting at. And a lot of times they're just trying to get something from you anyway. So you're like, well, can you hurry up so I can get to the point?
What are we actually doing?
Yeah, what are we doing here? Well, anyway, so what are we doing here? How did this line up?
How did what line up?
This show here at the Pablo.
Show?
You're on a tour for an album?
I am, yeah. So I am on the Midwest run of a national tour. I put out a record last month, a few weeks ago, called Bury the Lead. And we kicked off our tour with a few dates out west, then did an East Coast run, and now we're kind of back to home turf, Heartland, and doing a week sweeping through the Midwest. So yeah, this is our first kickoff club show of the Midwest run.
How many more shows do you have after this?
After Eau Claire, we'll head back up to Minneapolis, where I grew up, and then we'll hit Rochester, Madison, Chicago. Yeah.
A whole bunch before you go back to New York.
Yeah, we'll do a week or so, and then do the holidays and ramp up the machine again for the West Coast.
So the new album's called Bury the Lead. Mm-hmm. Where's that name come from? Because even when I read it, I was like, wait, lead?
Sure, it's spelled different. I was
confused for a second. And then I realized, I'm assuming you're talking about publication, like newspaper lead, right?
Yeah, it's a sort of an insider term in journalism or in writing. So when you've got, something big to say, but you don't put it right at the front of the article where it really shines, you're sometimes admonished for burying the lead. Mm-hmm.
Oh, so it's a little bit of a play on words. See, I was listening to other interviews with you, and I was like, man, I need to up my vocabulary game strong, because there's not that many times I listen to somebody and I'm like, can't follow 100% what they're talking about. I think you've just studied language for so long that maybe you forget that your vocabulary is huge in comparison to a lot of people, or maybe it's just me being in Eau Claire not knowing things.
No, I think what I have verbally, I lack spatially. So me trying to read a map is like a babe from the cradle. I have no spatial intelligence. So for me, I think all of it is just concentrated on the language.
Well, let's get back to some of the earlier stuff. I've listened to other interviews, and I don't want to tell the same story a million times, but you were an original member of Doomtree. I still don't, even listening to a bunch of interviews, a lot of things are just kind of glossed over. So I know that you wanted to have like your work published. You were always into language. So I knew you wanted to get like poetry or books published or whatever. And that pushed you into performing it because you couldn't find a publisher, because obviously if you don't have a name yet, no one's going to want to publish you. That's kind of how it works. So you did a poetry slam, which is where you go up on a mic, you speak your thing, and really you're doing a whole performance. And from there, that's what got you into rap music. But how did Doomtree was 7 members, right? How did that actually kind of come together with you?
To be honest, I wasn't a founding member of Doomtree. They existed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but so I was essentially kind of entering this slam competition, the World of Slam competition. So as you said, that's poetry performed, and it's competitive, And at least in those years, there was like a really significant overlap between the hip hop community and the slam community in the Twin Cities, but also just around the country. It was so shows like Def Poetry Jam, hosted by Russell Simmons, was a thing, and Erykah Badu and Saul Williams would make appearances in there. So it was sort of a significant space of overlap. And when I started competing and performing, sometimes members of Doomtree might be in the crowd, but also I first made my kind of first friend in the Minneapolis hip hop scene. His name was Yoni. He asked if I'd be game to join his rap crew. So my first rap crew was called Medita, and that was where I started cutting my teeth. He handed me a burned CD with this like line drawn bird on its back, dead with an X for an eye. And I listened to that and I was like, this slays. Who is this? And he was like, that's Doomtree. And I was like, okay, so where are they from? Is it like Pacific Northwest? Like where are they hailed from? And he was like, they're the dudes next door. And so I was unknowingly, hanging out on the regular, just a couple of houses down from the Doomtree house. Became friends with them, became fans of their work, was at their shows, kind of marveling at how raw and real and both like angry and approachable their live show and those dudes seemed. And eventually was asked into the crew. So yeah, they had their thing going before I was a member. And initially I think it was something like, 10 or 11 members.
See, I thought that. I thought I remember seeing pictures and there was like musicians, like people holding instruments and stuff too at one point in time. Like I vaguely can recall that. I'm thinking, I thought there was more than 7.
There were, we never were a live band, but several of the members of Doomtree were in bands beforehand where they would have been. So like Laserbeak was a member of like the indie rock Plastic Constellation. POS was a member of, I think it was Hard Knocks. He was a drummer in that crew. Yeah. Cool. So they had histories in sort of like punk house musician circles. Yeah.
So talking about the story of that, then obviously the natural thing is you cut your teeth there. Eventually you want to do some of your own stuff just because you then don't have to ask anybody else how to do it. You can kind of just do your own thing. Obviously, I'm sure you still want to do stuff with Doomtree that whole time too. So there's kind of both things happening. What's up with Doomtree at this point? I know it's a label, but do all the other guys, Cecil Otter and everybody, still perform? Do they perform underneath a different name? What kind of role do they have with you? Where is that?
Yeah. So, I think in some ways the precedent was already set before I joined, in that, rap is really flexible in that, you can have a crew record, you can think of other crews like Wu-Tang, right? And then you have these solo albums. So that was already sort of the kind of structure of releases and expectation. Like we combine as a clique on some stuff, and then everybody goes and kind of, develops their own sound and explores their own sonic interests without, as you mentioned, kind of needing to worry about how that might intersect with other people's tastes or interests in the crew. So I started rapping with them. I put out, a solo EP that did have like some more vocal harmonies on it, that kind of leaned into some of like the melancholy sounds that I like too. And then also a little bit of balladeering, so the record that I just put out, Bury the Lead, I think 10 of the 11 tracks were produced by my cohort in Doomtree, Laserbeak. So he and I have worked together steady on the past few releases. Really hard now, like as a production team. So it's me, it's him, and the third member of our team is a guy named Andy Thompson. And we all have really different skill sets. So Laserbeak is very much like, at the MPC, he makes stuff bang, so he's using snippets of audio in a sample-based way to build these rap beats. Andy Thompson is a composer as well, so he knows music theory. He can, I remember on one of the songs on a previous record being like, I want a bridge, but I want it to sound kind of like an Eleanor Rigby vibe, like it goes into strings, and then a totally different universe. And he like nodded 3 times, slowly swiveled his chair, and then on his MIDI keyboard played that bridge,
Cool.
you know, so a really
Yeah.
different music set. And for me, I think my strengths are, you know, lyrics and vocal melodies. So we all kind of meet in the middle, but bringing really different, like tools, tastes, and strengths to the table. So that's Laserbeak. And he's also doing a lot with other local Minneapolis artists too.
Does he work with only people in Minneapolis, or is he?
A good question. So his actually one of his first projects to like pop hard was Lizzo Bangers. So he did the first Lizzo CD. I know he's done remixes too for like Doja Cat.
Yeah,
You know, so
I saw that on Spotify, and I was like, so it can't be just Minnesota.
Yeah, right. Yeah, correct. He's got some kind of far-reaching projects as a producer. I know also like Craig Finn of the Hold Steady, you know, he's homies with him and has done some projects with him as well. So that's Laserbeak. I know that right now Cecil Otter is doing there's another local band called Solid Gold in Minneapolis. I really like their stuff. And I know that he's been working with them on their record for the past at least a couple years.
Cool.
Playing some stuff with them on stage live. But I think his primary interest, even since we were together in Doomtree, has been like he is happiest when he has headphones on and is making something beautiful.
Sure.
And that's not true with everybody. Do you know what I mean? I think
Right, yeah.
I think Sims and POS, like, and maybe Mike McLaughlin too. I think some of their happy places, you know, was on stage. It was behind a mic, jumping and sweating, you know. And I think probably I'm in the middle. I enjoy performance, and I find it like exhilarating and sometimes heartbreaking when you don't perform how you wish you would, and tiring, you know, when you're on the road. But for Cecil, like, he loves the music, and I think he's a really hypnotic performer, but I don't know that that's his favorite part of the gig.
Okay, sure.
You know what I mean?
Is that something you miss working with those guys, having somebody else to have the energy that you can play off of? I mean, of course you have other people on the stage, but when you're the front and center, everyone's looking at you, not really everybody else. So you kind of have to command that, which has its own power, right? Of being able to read the room and kind of play around with it. But when you have a collective of other people that are like hyped up, even if you're not having the best day, you're playing off them, right?
I think you're right. I mean, it is sort of like, if you conceptualize it, a headlining set feels like a relay race when it's Doomtree, because you have your sprint and then you can kind of hug the side of the stage, right? You can open a bottle of water. You're hyping whoever now is center stage, but you are deliberately in the wings until your next featured song, or your next featured verse at least. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You catch your breath. You hydrate. That's not the case as when you're, as in a solo environment. It is more of a measured long distance run.
Let me ask you this. You refer in a different interview about the relationship between a hype man and like the rapper up front. I've never heard anyone even really talk about that relationship or break it down before, which my friend Miles Boulevard, who opened for you when you were, or one of the people that opened for you anyways last time you came through, our mutual friend TYB, they play a lot of shows together, and TYB got hired to do, he got booked to do Pride out in Lincoln, Nebraska, I think, and he was like one of the headliners. So Miles went with him and didn't even perform any of his own stuff, really. He was just there as his hype man.
Yes.
And that's just a relationship. I don't really understand how it works, and I think most people who aren't in the industry don't understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the easiest analogy to make would be rapper is to hype man or hype person, right? As lead vocalist is to backup singer, right?
Sure,
so you've got a supporting voice with you, but as is often the case, like, the genre has its own conventions and expectations. So one of the things very often that a hype man is doing in hip hop is providing like another locus of connection and enthusiasm for the crowd, right? So that hype man is getting people hype.
Yeah,
You know, so I guess, I mean, now that I think about it and kind of slow down even just the nomenclature of it, we would use hype as a verb. So if you and I were on stage together, and we were working through, you know, some of the technical demands of a verse, like there's a couple of songs I'll be performing tonight where there's just very few opportunities to breathe in the verse because it happens super fast. So that's less of a challenge when you're in a vocal booth, because you're not moving your arms and your metabolism isn't ramped up from having jumped around for the last song or danced and being goofy, and you have 5 times to take it. You know, you can try. Whereas live, you just have a bigger like cardiological spend. You know what I mean? Your body is just burning more oxygen. And so it can be hard to do those verses as an unaccompanied vocalist. So if I were to say to you, hey, will you hype me? You'd say, yeah, hopefully. And then I would say, here's the lines I'd love. And very often they're at the very end of a phrase. Very often it's to either like punctuate a punchline, just like give it that extra gun of gas, or to provide me for an opportunity to inhale so that I can hit the next line hard.
Does that person have much room for interpretation, or is it really like you're the maestro telling them this is exactly where I need you for what?
I see. I mean, I would say that very often hypes will develop of their naturally. And so I might say, hey, could you get me on, and I'd say a line, could you get me on the word house down? And you say, cool. But then as we go and we tour, you realize, oh, it'd be stronger if in addition to house down, I did the line beforehand. And I go, rah, like when she starts the next thing. So I think a lot of it is, yes, you have to be, as a hype person, you want to make sure that your timing matches the lead vocalist if you're doing anything together. So that's important. You can't stretch a line. You got to try to match them. And they might change a little bit as the tour goes on. They might change when they're short of breath. So you have to try to anticipate that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a lot of times there's some spice rack elements that just develop naturally of their own accord, or you have a great idea about like adding, like today we'll add an echo where I say the word ready and Aviva goes, ready, 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 ready. So it's like you're sort of mimicking some of the effects that were created in studio, you know what I mean, in an analog way with your own voice, which I love. I love that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole skill set that somebody has to learn. And a lot of times that person has their own songs. There might be the opener that then like hops in, and that'll change show to show sometimes based on where people are at. So I'm impressed when people can kind of seamlessly do that, knowing that they don't necessarily only do that with that person all the time. Like I saw Ice Cube perform, and I'm sure it was the same hype man at all of his shows, but that's not going to be the case with everybody.
Absolutely not. I mean? And also I think it's something where it's a role and not a title, meaning it's not usually something that's your entire job.
Yeah.
A lot of hype men also have their own solo careers. And like you said, sometimes it's the opener. The thing you just got to do really well if you're going to hype is you have to know that song inside and out. Inside and out. I remember when we were in the van sometimes in Doomtree, someone would, idly, like while we're driving, say the first line of a rap song. And then it would be quiet, and we would all just do our hypes. Hey, hey. Everybody gonna, like, total silence, but for 3.5 minutes, mostly quiet, and we would all just kind of land these hypes together. But yeah, in the same way that Sims might hype me, I would hype Sims. You know what I mean? So it's a role that you play to support the show.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice when you can take a whole seat back, because some songs you're just not even really on.
Oh,
like you don't have a verse at all. So to be able to actually have breaks throughout a show, that's I'm sure it helps as far as not being sweating like profusely and still being able to keep your voice going. You guys put out a lot of records. How many records have you put out in total if you include your solo albums as well as Doomtree at this point?
I have absolutely no idea.
If you scroll through on Spotify, I was just in Australia and I was driving probably like 4 to 5 hours a day. I was camping at a different national park every night.
Cool.
I was like, this is a perfect time for me to just listen to a bunch. So I did way more research for this interview than like any other one because I was driving so much. So I listened to a lot. But I was like, man, there's a lot of music to process between all of this. Because the first album came out in 2006, 5?
Gosh, I think mine came out, probably 2000. Maybe even a year or two earlier than that.
Yeah.
Maybe 2005, something like that.
It's been going for a while. So anyways, nowadays, though, you do a lot. So especially at the beginning, you kind of have to like make a name for yourself.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to juggle anything because you need the one thing to be good enough, to begin with. What are you juggling right now besides this album? I mean, I could try to list them all. You did a podcast with the BBC and you've done a lot of things. So what currently do you kind of have on your plate that you do?
Yeah, I think even at the very beginning of my career, like my interests were very, I guess you'd say cross-disciplinary. But essentially to me, it felt like, hey, I have an interest in language and in language wielded with style and in interesting ways, almost no matter what format that occurs in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I love a clever turn of phrase in a rap song. I love a really hot, quip in an essay. I like poetry. I like even just like people who are really good at conversation. Do you know what I mean? It just that feels like a swift game of like ping pong or something, people who are like trading barbs in a friendly way back and forth. I love that. That feels like an art form in its own right. So now, you know, all these years in, I feel like in some ways I've just been able to lean into some of those interests and release some of that work. But even in the beginning, I was still writing poems and writing essays and the like. So a few years ago, I wrote a book that's like a collection of essays held together by a memoiristic through line of falling in and out of love, essentially. And that's called My Own Devices. That was the first thing that I like got published hardcover, New York Press. And for me, it had been a long time trying. So that was like tears on the street.
Well, yeah, since before rapping.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
yeah, it was like tears on the street in New York when I got the call. Call my mom right away. And then, you know, also have done some work for the BBC. The podcast that I hosted for a couple seasons was like behavioral science, essentially. So interviewing researchers, psychologists, anthropologists to talk about why humans behave the way we do. And I dig that too. Like I'm kind of a self-taught, I guess, science nerd on some of that stuff as well. And now touring this record, starting to like in earnest, you know, pick up the pen a little bit more. I'm working on a collection of poetry that I've been slowly chipping away at for like more years than I'd like to acknowledge. And yeah, I just finished a 3-night run with the Minnesota Orchestra, which obviously it's still music, but it feels like a really different lane like that.
Putting on it is.
It is. Yeah, because it is. And so putting on a show with them, it just is a completely different task. And when I sing with a lot of voices on stage, who are also like the front people of their own projects, but have agreed, you know, for that night to come together as sort of like this little pop choir. And I don't read music. And so singing all of their parts individually to record for everybody to learn is a really big part of that job. Abby Wolf, my longtime friend and collaborator, does that too. So that's been my focus, I think, for a long time, right up until this album was released. So.
And that all came about because of the Hamilton.
You know, it was actually just before that, I think. Or I don't know if in part, maybe the Hamilton mixtape track that I cut was what enabled like a more serious consideration of me as a collaborator with the Minnesota Orchestra. But it came like of an email from them saying, hey, would you be game to do something a few years ago? And every couple of years since, we've put on, you know, a big show that has like a scaffolding of monologue running through it, you know, and then songs that are totally re-envisioned by Andy Thompson, who reorchestrates them complete, like burns down the song and resurrects it anew from the powdered ash to be played by, you know, dozens and dozens of virtuosic orchestral players. So
let me ask you this. You were talking about the verbal ping pong, which I really, really like that. And that's what happens when you have a collective like Doomtree, but you really don't feature a lot of people and you don't hop on as features on a lot. Why is that? I feel like if that was something you really enjoyed, people want to collaborate all the time these days. Like, I feel like there's plenty of people you could hit up and do that.
That's true. I mean, I think so for features, that's a familiar phrase to us, just in case people aren't familiar with it. Like, I think it is a feature of rap music more than in other genres where like you have a verse where people hop on for a 16, you know, so that you sell a 16 bar essentially. I mean, I've done some of that featuring myself on other people's project. I recently did one a few months ago for Video Dave, who tours with Open Mike Eagle on the regular. But you're right. On my records, I almost never do. And I think in part it's because it's easy and exciting for me to collaborate musically with people. I don't have the skill set that Andy does, like at all. And I don't have the skill set that Laserbeak does. There is no opportunity for me to feel territorial because I don't know how to do that. Sure. You know, I've made a handful of beats and or written, you know, a handful of songs skeletally on a piano or on a beat machine, but that's not my primary strength. Right. But for writing, you know, very often it's like I have a vision for how I want a song to go. And it's hard for me to let go some of that control. And, you know, I write, not all the time, but I write a decent number of story songs. So that's not the kind of thing that is as easily done in tandem, right? You know, like, yeah. So
still, I feel like that's such a far jump away to then not come back and dabble into after being in something like Doomtree where there's tracks that you're literally only hyping on throughout the performance. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
And then other ones that really, I don't know, are there any Doomtree songs where you're the entire vocal? I don't think that is, right? There's somebody on them.
Yeah, rarely. I mean, I think that was sort of the feature though of our collaborative records was like almost all those songs would have at least two, almost all the songs would have at least two MCs on it, because that was what made a Doomtree record was itself the collaboration. Whereas very often when a solo MC was doing their thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They might have some features, but that is the showcase for their style and their voice. But you're right. I do have fewer features than most. Yeah. And I think it is just sort of an attachment to the songwriting that on the occasions that I'm charting the chorus for the entire song, I'm real particular about it. When I'm collaborating, if I only know like, hey, your job is to helm the ship for a 16.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Then I can start my story or, whatever. But I can start my verse and end my verse so that it feels self-contained. And that was my contribution to the thing.
And that's why it worked with doing the podcast where there's like 17 other people that help make that possible, and the orchestra stuff and everything else. Because those ones, obviously, you don't have that much control over it.
I don't. But again, it's like the thing that I feel most attached to, which is the words and the narrative arc. I did have a lot of control over that, almost total control in the orchestra stuff, and I'm sure it sometimes irritated my producers at the BBC, but I was at least eager to have a lot of that control in the podcast too.
It was interesting listening to the podcast. I was like, wow, for someone who has never done a podcast, and I had to remind myself, she had a team of people to make this thing really cool. And that took a lot of gusto of you to never do a podcast before, but then hop in on something that you knew was going to be like a pretty big thing. There's so many people involved and go, cool, yeah, I'll be the face, well, the voice in this case, you know what I mean, of this whole project for right now. And it's going to go well. Going with the confidence of it,
Gosh, I mean, so much talent there, and I met a lot of producers. I was also just learning how the thing is done in real time. But yeah, there even, I feel like there were some natural, like, complementary skill sets. It's like there's this phenomenal researchers. Ellie House, particularly, I remember meeting her. She's super young, and I was like, I have a feeling that one day I'm gonna say I knew Ellie House. Like, this woman is a powerhouse. And Simon Mabin was like a producer there that I worked with on a regular, who I think his skill set is one that I don't know how to exert. So when he's kind of building exactly the list of guests, we would do that together, but he would do a pre-call with them to kind of chat them up, figure out exactly what they can contribute. Similarly, on my side of the line, I wrote the scripts, and that was really important to me, with a lot of feedback, of course, but it was like everyone was game to say, okay, you drive the keyboard on this, and what doesn't work, we will certainly tell you.
Yeah.
But I got to use my own kind of authorial voice, which for me was a big part of the appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and to be able to all of a sudden talk to people you otherwise would have no real reason to contact.
That too.
Just having like a thirst for knowledge. Talking with you, very obviously, you just want to know things. You're the type of person who, if you don't know something, I'm sure you're like, now I have to find out and research a whole bunch. To be able to get a hold of some of these like scientists and stuff, they don't just answer phone calls.
Totally that. Yeah. And like the idea of being able to research something that I found really interesting, under the auspices of a job was rad.
Yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, similar situation to this. I get to talk to all kinds of different people that I'm like, I would totally be doing this for free all the time, and now that it's part of my career and I can actually use it as an excuse of like, this is my work day.
Yes.
It's pretty dope. And then a lot of times, like, I'll see the show. Like, I'll probably come to the show tonight. I interviewed Reza backstage. She's this illusionist who performed here like a month ago. Super dope. So I interviewed him on that couch right there. And then he gave me tickets. So I brought my kids and stuff too. So my kids got to sit in, and then he had me come up into the act. It was a whole thing. It was pretty dope. So I do a lot of things, bouncing my skateboard shop, painting, and that's like my career stuff. And then I do a bunch of things outside of that. One thing that I find myself feeling really guilty for, and I have to keep checking myself, is not giving 100% of myself to any individual one of them. When there's so many other people that give 100% of themselves to that one thing. You obviously do the same thing. How do you manage that? How do you not feel guilty about giving your time to this podcast, or as an example, giving your time to the podcast when all these fans of yours just want another album? You feel like you're letting him down.
I do feel guilty. I feel like even during this interview, I'm just like, oh, I haven't spent nearly as much time writing as I am implying that I'm spending writing. And I know that, from the perspective of the friends and the team that I work with on the literary stuff, they're not out here on the road. They're like, where is the next book? I am essentially idle from their perspective. So yeah, I would say I don't have a magic pill or bullet for that one. I do. There's just, there's only so much that you can cram into a single life. And so you just try to stuff it in until the zipper gives,
How do you decide where to put your time?
I would say partly driven by passion, like, oh, this is so cool. But also in a way that I wouldn't recommend as best practices. I think part of it is also like, I am probably too ready to attend to what is urgent as opposed to what is important. So sure. I do often find myself kind of like backed against the wall in a deadline. Like, oh, okay, you got to do this tonight because it was due yesterday. So yeah, I could probably benefit from a little bit more thoughtful analysis there. But I'm also like, as long as I'm working most days, it doesn't matter too much what I'm doing because the next day I'll probably catch up on the other things. So if I'm tired and I don't feel like writing, there's always emails to send, tours to advance. I could book hotels for the next run. I could plot the drives and work out the day sheets and the times and all that jazz. And then on the days that you feel more creative, you do that stuff.
Yeah, I actually find it nice having a bunch of different outlets because then whatever is working at that moment, you can kind of go that way. Because creatively, you can't force it to happen. And if it's not happening, like with art for me, if I'm trying to design this thing, sometimes it's just not working and I can't work on that today. And if I do, it's just not going to be productive, either way. Versus I just painted this gym. I wish they had the most recent volume 1 because I was just a big feature in the newspaper. I was going to leave it just to like gloat. But anyways, I talked to the guy and he had this idea and he's like, yeah, you could do whatever you want with it. And like immediately I knew what I wanted to paint. And it took me like an hour on my iPad and I had that full design, like fully ready to go. It was just there, but it doesn't always work that way.
I was going to say that feels so good when that happens.
It's rare when it works that way. It's rare
for me too, though.
What was the music scene like as far as the other people you were involved with that you got to see come up back then? Because Lizzo, you just kind of like threw that out there randomly. You must have met her, right? Because she came up there, you know what I mean? And there's been other artists that have came up and left too. Unfortunately, everyone seems to leave Minnesota. But what were some of the other artists that you were excited you got to see or collaborate with throughout those years?
Yeah, I mean, Lizzo was rad. Like I loved watching her work with Beak. I had the opportunity to share stages with her. She was kind enough to do some backup vocals when I was releasing one of my records years and years ago. So an obvious talent that was rad to see. I think we've also got some really cool, like more folky lyricists. Jeremy Messersmith comes to mind. He's like a dude with a guitar, but he's just got a super sharp pen and a really pretty voice. I think he's great. So he was kind of the same cohort as me, coming up. Abby Wolf, who I mentioned before, huge range. And she and I think met like at an open mic, probably when we were both underage. And immediately there was kind of like a binary star thing. Like, who is that lady? I think I was doing poetry at the time, not even singing yet. And we ended up sharing the stage in all sorts of ways. She's got a new project out called Champagne Confetti, which is rad. And then to my discredit, I wasn't following as carefully as I should. But I think that Lady Midnight, who's opening tonight for me on this like Midwest run, man, what like a magnetic 10,000 watt smile and just like a really mesmerizing stage presence and unusual. She's cool, man. I think she's really strong as well.
And I don't think anyone here knows who she is yet.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about her, because I even like very briefly researched, but
Sure.
I'm like, I've never heard this name before.
Yeah. So she has, been involved in a variety of projects in Minneapolis, but I think we probably were first in the same room when she was singing for I think it was mostly a salsa band called Malamania. And dope, fun. I'm badly dance salsa, whatever, used to go out every once in a while. And then Laserbeak started working with her years later as Lady Midnight. And it's just so cool. It is kind of dancey. It's super thoughtful. I'm a sucker for vocal harmonies. And she does layers of these like really lush but hip. So it doesn't, it's affected on occasion in some cool kind of messy, muddy tech ways, and then, comes into crisp clarity. Like, it's just really well produced and thoughtfully done. Catchy too.
How does she do that live?
Let's find out. I've seen her, I've seen her a handful of times. We've also become homies. I've seen her a handful of times in different configurations. So when we're at, First Ave in Minneapolis, where we both have, we're both staying. So you're not, if you have some extra friends with you on stage, you're not putting them up in hotels. It's just easier to do fiscally, right? So she'll have a full band on stage with her in Minneapolis. And here she'll be working with DJ Cassiopeia. So I'm excited to see it. And I know that she's also doing some processing live on stage vocally. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw somebody else do that. Ani DeFranco's opener. I feel so bad. I can't think of her name right now, or their name right now. But they did that. They like layered it on stage live, and it was cool? It was badass to see live. The only time I think I've ever seen that is like Reggie Watt on YouTube. Like I haven't seen too many people really loop it like that. Or Carnage. Carnage, the Executioner?
Yep.
What a legend. I've been waiting. We've talked a bunch of times. I got to interview him at some point. And Ian's not here either. Why didn't you bring Ian Allison?
So
I messaged him today. I was
Did you?
Yeah, I was like, I'm interviewing Dessa later. You're coming to Eau Claire, right? And he's like, no, sorry. I was like, dude, I interviewed him for the show on the show like a year and a half ago or something. Yeah, so I've been waiting to catch up with him. I was super bummed that he wasn't here.
What a approachable, personable.
Talk about infectious energy, right?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I was introduced to Ian, who plays bass and is just like a phenomenal kind of all-around musician though, but he's a bassist, and I was introduced to him by my bandmate Joshua Holmgren, who on stage tonight will play like keys and sax, and he was just like, you got to meet Ian. I was like, okay, and was just lived up to and exceeded absolutely every promise. Like, that dude is just down, like manages to like crush it as a really featured player when he's on stage, because your eye naturally goes to him. I'm making like just
when he's like 6'5" or something.
He's exactly. He's 9 feet tall, but also he's just like so good at sonically dialing in exactly the right tone. Whether it's like beautiful and pristine and round and tender, or if it's just like gritty and noisy and mean. He's great at dialing that in. And does so with like a total team player. Hi, I'm Ian. Like, no huge ego. Just like, hey, do you think this could work? Yeah, man, I think that could work. Like, he's so great. So he's also featured a lot on the record. After the introduction that Joshua made, I think immediately started sending him songs to play on to record.
Who have you met since you've gone out to New York? It's an interesting concept, growing up and establishing yourself in the Minnesota scene so much. Like, it is a big scene, but it's not that big.
Sure.
Where anyone in the music scene knows who you are in Minnesota. You go to New York, that's not going to be true, right? It's a huge thing where all of a sudden you're this tiny little fish in this big sea, which is exciting because of the level of opportunity, right? All of a sudden, the people you can collaborate with aren't just in this one little bubble anymore. People come to New York from everywhere too, right? How has that kind of changed your music for you?
I mean, in some way, I would say that it surprises a lot of people that I think the Minneapolis hip hop scene is a bright enough light to have attracted people to Minneapolis to make music. Yeah. You know what I mean? Is it underground? Yes. Are you going to get signed to a major? Very unlikely. But there are people making a living, making music and making a name for themselves that resonates in cities on the coast. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether that's the Rhymesayers, Cats, or whoever.
Yeah, of
course. So anyway, that said, yes, 100%. You become a beta fish in an ocean for sure, going to New York. But I also am excited to, as a music listener and a showgoer, like see, okay, does every show come through Minneapolis? No. And it's been really fun to be like, whoa, this is, whether it's, a small local Brooklyn talent that would just be less likely to thrive in Minneapolis, whether it's a beautiful flamenco vocalist. And do we have a flamenco scene? We do. Yeah. Is it huge? No, it's Minnesota. That's not the epicenter of that art. Right. And so, part of it is probably just like also being exposed to the sounds that I might not have otherwise stumbled into. Like there's a Balkan folk scene there, Hungarian music that's played in 11, instead of 4/4 time. I don't know anything about that, but I really like some of those sounds. You know what I mean? So I think it's also just like expanding my horizons as a, I don't like the word consumer necessarily, but yeah, I guess as a consumer of art, you know, as a listener, as a showgoer. And then I feel like Minneapolis in a lot of ways is a great place to make music. It has so many infrastructural features that it might not be evident on first glance, but are there and are not present in other cities. Like, we have venues that are small to start out in. We have the mid-sized venues to grow into. We have a community of bookers who are game to try to like help you lily pad your way up. You know what I mean? People who are going on a date will say, hey, let's go to a show. That's not true in every city.
Sure.
It's, you know what I mean? Like sometimes it just socially, the social fabric is more like, hey, let's go to dinner and a movie. The fact that people are game to check out new local artists is huge. That said, I do think that for me, there is something really refreshing about the unapologetic kind of drive and ambition in New York that sometimes it did feel sort of was like you'd low key get. The implication was that you were presumptuous or you were too big for your britches and like, don't think you're special. Well, don't be a jerk, but go and try to be special. Like, go do that. Like, reach big. And if you don't get it, that's okay. But like, go try.
Yeah. I think it's good that you got out there when you did, you know, because Midwest Nice is very much a thing. Not that that's not everywhere else, but it is in here where I don't think people are quite as competitive because you just don't have to be to make a living or anything else. So I think people are a little bit more ready to try to help, and they want to see a music scene grow. They're not worried about themselves being faded out so much or like losing limelight. That's what I've noticed around here. Versus I think in some other big cities, there's so many people that just like flock there that everyone feels like they need to be the loudest one. You know what I'm saying? It's not, it's different. But again, it presents totally different opportunities too.
I do, but at the same time, I feel like, I think drive and competition are related. I'm not going to say they're not, but I do think they're distinct, which is to say, I think the natural assumption when you go into the arts is like, okay, I'm competing. You know what I mean? I'm competing with my peers. But I think my experience in living it, at least in the lane that I'm in, you know, I'm not up for a Grammy this year, right? So I'm not competing with 5 other people for a Grammy. I'm trying to sell out shows. I'm trying to, you know, move some records. I'm trying to connect with new fans. My competition isn't other artists. Like my competition is staying in and watching Netflix, right?
Yeah,
so
totally.
It's like, or my competition is laundry, you know? I don't get the sense that my biggest hurdle is other artists succeeding. I think that my biggest hurdle is to connect with new people in a compelling enough way that they're game to like sort out a babysitter on a Friday night.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. I want to ask one more question because I ask this one on every episode of my show. When you do things that you're passionate about for a living, you get to have really unique experiences that are rarely money related. They're just really cool things that happen to you that you're like, wow. I mean, as an example, I heard your music in college 15 years ago, and I'm like, oh, cool. I'm doing this today. This is pretty dope. What's an example of something that you're really grateful for that happened to you because you chose to pursue, I guess, everything you do, language arts?
I think the opportunity to like sit down with some neuroscientists was a big one. So for me, you know, I was trying to figure out like a conceit, you know, a structure to present my orchestra hall show. I knew I wanted to sing all these songs, but I also wanted to have a story because I'd be introducing myself to a lot of people, right? And it's like, they're not going to know the words and sing it back. I've got to kind of earn, it's like a show, but it's also an audition. Yeah, sure. And so I ended up doing this project that was related to kind of torch songs. So my long career of like writing, you know, broken-hearted songs. And I decided to try to tackle that subject matter from a different angle and ended up scanning my own brain many times in a 7T fMRI scanner to see how some of those feelings were visualized and like the neuroanatomical parts of the brain that are involved in those feelings that have driven so much of my songwriting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which turned into a TED Talk.
Yeah,
This Minnesota rapper is now doing TED Talks. So, well, thank you so much again for taking the time to do this. Give one shout out really quick. Well, I do want to say thank you so much to the Pablo Center for making this happen and bringing you here. Again, I thought you were in New York, so I was like, dude, she's back finally. Hell yeah. So again, thanks for the Pablo Center for making this happen. But give a shout out. What's the name of your new album? Where should people go listen to it? How can they best support you moving forward? Do they need to go to the show? Obviously, but I mean, should they order t-shirts online? You know, all the things.
Oh man, thanks for the opportunity to do the direct shout out. Okay, so the name of the new record is called Bury the Lead.
L-E-D-E.
L-E-D-E, Bury the Lead. I'm Dessa with 2 S's. And yeah, I think if people are game to come to a show, that's one of the absolute best ways to support. Otherwise, as simple as it sounds, like following on social media is like a really great way, because so many of the other opportunities that we seek as artists are like the first thing that a potential partner will do. We'll check that metric. So staying connected in that way is huge. And you can find the new record, Bury the Lead, anywhere you look for music, whether it's streaming or on shelves at a local retailer.
So come to the show and take a picture. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Passion Pod. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. We'll see you soon.